Destiny is not a gift, it is a conquest taken by the bold. On the rugged island of Corsica, a child was born into a world of fading nobility. He was named Napoleonic, a name that would soon shake the foundations of Europe. He grew up wild and proud, resentful of the French conquest of his homeland. His father secured him a scholarship to a military academy in France. There, the young Corsican felt like an outsider, mocked for his accent and poverty. He retreated into books, studying Alexander and Caesar with a burning intensity. He learned that power belongs to those who dare to seize it. At 16, he became a lieutenant in the artillery, a technical branch suited to his sharp mind. The French Revolution erupted in 1789, shattering the old world. Chaos consumed Paris, but for Napoleon, chaos was a ladder. He returned to Corsica hoping to lead his people, but was rejected by the nationalist power. Forced to flee, his family arrived in France as refugees, destitute and desperate. The revolution was now his only hope for survival and advancement. At the siege of Toulon, he saw his first true chance for glory. The British Navy held the harbor, threatening the fragile republic. Captain Bonaparte proposed a daring plan to capture the heights overlooking the port. He led the assault personally, undeterred by the rain of bullets. A British bayonet stabbed his thigh, but he refused to leave the field. His cannons roared, forcing the British fleet to retreat in panic. Toulon fell, and a 24-year-old captain became a general. But the political winds in Paris were shifting and dangerous. He was briefly imprisoned after the fall of Robespierre, his career hanging by a thread. Released but unemployed, he walked the streets of Paris in a worn uniform. Then came the royalist uprising of 13 Vendémiaire, threatening the convention. They needed a sword, and they turned to the young general from Toulon. He did not hesitate, deploying cannons to sweep the streets of Paris. He gave them a whiff of grape shot, crushing the rebellion in hours. He had saved the Republic, and the Republic rewarded him with command. It was then he met Rose de Beauharnais, a widow of fading grace. He renamed her Josephine and fell in love with a desperate passion. She was his anchor, even as his eyes turned toward the Alps. He was given command of the Army of Italy, a ragtag force of starving men. They had no shoes, no pay, and little hope of victory. Napoleon arrived and promised them honor, glory, and riches beyond measure. He did not just command them, he electrified their spirits. He struck quickly, separating the Austrian and Piedmontese armies. Speed was his weapon, defying the slow traditions of 18th century warfare. At Lodi, he stormed a narrow bridge under heavy Austrian fire. His men saw him in the smoke, aiming cannons like a common soldier. They began to call him the Little Corporal, a title of affection and awe. He swept through Milan, establishing a new order and demanding heavy tributes. Masterpieces of art were packed into crates and sent back to Paris. He was not just a general anymore. He was a political force. At Arcole, the battle stalled in the swamps against a superior enemy. He grabbed a flag and rushed the bridge, slipping into the mud. His grenadiers dragged him to safety, inspired by his reckless courage. The Austrians sent army after army, but he defeated them all in detail. At Rivoli, he crushed the main Austrian force, securing Italy for France. He dictated peace on his own terms, ignoring the orders from Paris. He returned to France a hero, eclipsing the politicians of the Directory. But Paris was too small for his ambition. He needed a new stage. He looked east, to the land of pharaohs and ancient mysteries. The expedition to Egypt was a dream of empire, rivaling Alexander the Great. He brought scientists and artists, intent on unlocking the secrets of the past. The Mamluk cavalry awaited him in the desert, clad in medieval splendor. At the Battle of the Pyramids, he formed his infantry into hollow squares. The Mamluk charges broke against the wall of French bayonets and fire. "Soldiers, 40 centuries look down upon you," he told his men. He entered Cairo as a conqueror, establishing a French institute. But the sea belonged to the British, and Admiral Nelson was hunting him. At the Nile, the French fleet was annihilated in a fiery night battle. Napoleon was trapped in his conquest, cut off from France. He marched into Syria, facing the plague and the Ottoman army. At Jaffa, the horrors of war tested his soul and his reputation. He visited the plague hospital, touching the sick to quell the panic. But the fortress of Acre held out, forcing a bitter retreat to Egypt. Back in Cairo, news arrived of defeats in Europe and chaos in Paris. The Directory was crumbling, and France was crying out for a leader. He made a cold calculation, abandoning his army to return to France. He risked capture by the British Navy, slipping across the Mediterranean in secrecy. He landed in France not as a deserter, but as a savior. The people cheered him, tired of corruption and endless war. He arrived in Paris with a plan to seize power once and for all. The plot was set for the 18th of Brumaire. He entered the legislature facing the shouting deputies who called him a tyrant. He was jostled and threatened, his composure momentarily shaken. But his brother Lucien saved the day, rallying the soldiers outside. The grenadiers cleared the hall, ending the rule of the Directory. Napoleon was named first consul, the new master of France. He was 30 years old, and the world was at his feet. He declared, "The revolution is over. I am the revolution." He set to work rebuilding the state, sleeping only a few hours a night. He created the Bank of France, stabilizing the economy after years of ruin. He rewrote the laws, creating the civil code that bears his name. Merit, not birth, would decide a man's worth in his new France. But the Austrians were threatening again, and war was inevitable. He planned a daring crossing of the Alps, echoing Hannibal. His army dragged cannons through snow and ice, defying nature itself. He descended into Italy, surprising the Austrian forces completely. At Marengo, the battle seemed lost as the French were pushed back. But the arrival of Desailles turned the tide, snatching victory from defeat. Desailles died in the charge, but Napoleon secured his grip on power. Peace was signed, and for a brief moment, guns fell silent in Europe. He turned his attention to England, gathering a massive invasion fleet. But the British Navy remained the wooden wall he could not breach. He sold Louisiana to America, funding his wars and shedding a burden. In Paris, plots against his life grew, fueled by royalist spies. He used the threats to consolidate his power even further. Why be a consul when he could be an emperor? He invited the Pope to Paris, staging a coronation for the ages. In Notre Dame, he took the crown and placed it on his own head. He crowned Josephine empress, tears streaming down her face. The Republic was dead, long live the empire. But the monarchs of Europe formed a new coalition against him. The Russian and Austrian armies marched west to crush the usurper. He abandoned the invasion of England and turned his army east. The Grande Armée moved with terrifying speed, a machine of war. He surrounded the Austrians at Ulm, forcing a surrender without a fight. He marched into Vienna, sleeping in the palace of the Habsburg emperors. But the Russians were regrouping, and the decisive battle loomed. He chose the ground carefully, near the town of Austerlitz. He feigned weakness, abandoning the Pratzen Heights to lure the enemy. It was the anniversary of his coronation, a day of destiny. The sun rose on the 2nd of December, burning off the morning mist. He watched from his command post, cool and calculating. The Allies fell into his trap, weakening their center to attack his flank. He unleashed the thunder, sending Soult to storm the heights. The French infantry broke the Russian line, splitting the enemy army. It was his masterpiece, a tactical victory of absolute perfection. The emperors of Russia and Austria fled in disarray. He told his soldiers, "You will return home beneath triumphal arches." He commissioned the Arc de Triomphe, a monument to their glory. He redrew the map of Europe, placing his brothers on thrones. The Holy Roman Empire was dissolved, 1,000 years of history ended. But Prussia, proud and fearful, declared war on France. They believed their army was the envy of the world. Napoleon moved against them before they could coordinate with Russia. At Jena and Auerstedt, he crushed the Prussian military machine in a single day. He entered Berlin, paying respects at the tomb of Frederick the Great. He issued the Berlin Decree, trying to starve Britain economically. The Continental System was born, a war of trade and blockade. But Russia remained, a vast and wintry giant in the east. He marched into Poland, greeted as a liberator by the people. He met Marie Walewska, a Polish countess who captured his heart. The winter campaign was brutal, a slog through mud and snow. At Eylau, the slaughter was immense, a draw written in blood. He walked the field, moved by the piles of frozen corpses. He waited for spring to deliver the final blow. At Friedland, he caught the Russian army with its back to the river. The victory forced Tsar Alexander to the negotiating table. They met on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River. two emperors dividing the world between them, swearing eternal friendship. Napoleon was at his zenith, the master of the continent. But the Spanish ulcer began to bleed his empire dry. He had replaced the Spanish king with his brother Joseph. The Spanish people rose in revolt. A brutal guerrilla war ensued. It was a war without rules of ambushes and atrocities. Britain sent an army to Portugal, led by Wellington. The French armies were stretched thin, fighting on two fronts. Austria saw a chance and declared war again in 1809. Napoleon rushed back from Spain to face the threat on the Danube. At Aspern-Essern, he suffered his first major defeat in the field. He lost his friend Lannes, weeping by his side as he died. But he regrouped, crossing the Danube again at Wagram. It was a massive clash of artillery, shaking the earth. He secured a hard-fought victory, forcing Austria to bow once more. To seal the peace, he sought a new alliance through marriage. Josephine could not give him an heir, the tragedy of his life. He divorced her, the only woman he truly loved, for the sake of the dynasty. He married Marie-Louise, the daughter of the Austrian emperor. A son was born, the King of Rome, securing the succession. But the friendship with the Tsar was unraveling. Russia was suffering under the continental system, unable to trade timber. Alexander opened his ports to neutral ships, defying the French blockade. Napoleon saw this as a personal betrayal and a challenge to his power. He began to gather the largest army the world had ever seen. Soldiers from 20 nations marched under his command. Italians, Germans, Poles, and Dutch joined the French legions. 600,000 men moved toward the Niemen River. It was a river of steel flowing east, a display of imperial might. He believed one decisive battle would bring Russia to heel. In June 1812, he crossed the river into Russian territory. The sun was blazing, the heat oppressive and suffocating. The Russians did not stand and fight. They retreated into the vastness. They burned their own villages, leaving nothing for the invaders. Scorched earth was their weapon, denying food and shelter. The Grande Armée marched into a void of dust and smoke. Horses died by the thousands from exhaustion and poor feed. Dysentery ravaged the ranks before a single cannon was fired. Napoleon sought the decisive battle, but the enemy slipped away like ghosts. He reached Smolensk, a holy city with ancient walls. The battle was fierce, the city consumed by flames. But the Russian army escaped again, pulling him deeper into the trap. The road to Moscow lay open, but it was a road of death. His generals advised him to stop, to winter in Smolensk. But his ambition pushed him forward, gambling on one final blow. At Borodino, the Russians finally turned to fight. It was a clash of giants on a field of rolling hills. Napoleon was ill, suffering from a high fever and fatigue. He sat on a drum, watching the slaughter with glazed eyes. The French assaulted the earthworks, the Bagracian fleches. Cannonballs plowed through the dense columns of infantry. Marshal Ney, the bravest of the brave, led the charge. Murat led the cavalry, his uniform flashing in the smoke. The Raevski redoubt became a volcano of fire and death. Bodies piled up in mounds, the ground slick with blood. It was the bloodiest day in the history of warfare. Napoleon refused to send in his imperial guard. He needed them to preserve his crown and his safety. The Russians withdrew in good order, unbeaten in spirit. The road to Moscow was clear, but the price was terrible. Napoleon rode into the ancient capital, expecting a delegation of boyars. He waited at the gates, but no one came to surrender. The city was deserted, a ghost town of wooden palaces. He took up residence in the Kremlin, the heart of the Tsars. That night, the wind picked up and the sky turned red. Fires broke out across the city, set by Russian patriots. The wooden city burned like a torch encircling the Kremlin. Napoleon watched from a window, his face illuminated by the flames. "What a people," he whispered. "They burn their own history." He was trapped in the ashes of his conquest. He waited for a letter from Alexander, believing reason would prevail. But the Tsar remained silent in St. Petersburg. October came and the first snowflakes drifted down. The Russian winter, General Winter, had arrived early. Napoleon finally gave the order to retreat. Too late. The army turned back, weighed down by loot and wounded. The retreat became a death march through a frozen hell. Temperatures plummeted, freezing men where they stood. They wrapped themselves in furs and women's silks to survive. Food ran out and soldiers fought over horse meat. The Cossacks harried the flanks, striking like wolves. They cut off stragglers, showing no mercy to the frozen ghosts. Marshal Ney commanded the rear guard, fighting with a musket. He was the last Frenchman to leave Russian soil. At the Berezina River, the trap nearly snapped shut. Russian armies converged from three sides to crush them. Dutch engineers stood in freezing water to build bridges. They died of hypothermia so the emperor could cross. The crossing was a scene of panic and despair. Thousands were left behind or drowned in the icy waters. Napoleon abandoned the remnants of his army to rush to Paris. He needed to secure his throne before the news of disaster spread. He arrived at the Tuileries, unshaven and exhausted. The Grande Armée was gone, buried in the Russian snow. But his enemies sensed that the lion was wounded. Prussia, long humiliated, rose up and switched sides. They joined Russia in a new coalition to liberate Europe. Napoleon scraped together a new army from the youth of France. Teenagers, called the Marie-Louises, filled the ranks. They knew how to decide, but they did not know how to ride. He lacked cavalry, the eyes and ears of his army, yet he campaigned in Germany with the energy of his youth. At Lutzen, he rallied the raw recruits under fire. He won the battle but could not pursue the enemy. At Bautzen, another victory, but the Allies slipped away. Austria, led by Metternich, played a double game. Metternich met Napoleon in Dresden, offering a compromise. Napoleon rejected it, refusing to rule a diminished France. He threw his hat across the room in a rage. War resumed, and Austria joined the coalition against him. Now all of Europe was marching against one man. He won a brilliant tactical victory at the Battle of Dresden, but his marshals were being defeated on other fronts. The Allies learned to avoid him and attack his subordinates. They closed the ring around him at Leipzig. The Battle of the Nations raged for 3 days. He was outnumbered 2-1, facing a wall of fire. The Saxon troops betrayed him, turning their guns on the French. He was forced to order a retreat across the Ulster River. A corporal panicked and blew the bridge too early. Thousands of French troops were trapped on the wrong side. Marshal Poniatowski, the Polish hero, drowned trying to swim. It was a catastrophe, marking the end of French power in Germany. Typhus swept through the retreating army, killing thousands more. He crossed the Rhine, returning to defend the sacred soil of France. The Allies hesitated, afraid to invade the lion's den, but they crossed the borders in early 1814. Napoleon had only a skeleton force to defend Paris. He fought the campaign of France with desperate brilliance. He used interior lines, striking the separated Allied columns. At Champaubert, he crushed a Russian corps. At Montmirail, he defeated the Prussians. At Vauchamp, he routed them again. For a moment, it seemed he could achieve the impossible. The Allies were terrified, pausing their advance, but the sheer weight of numbers was overwhelming. He could not be everywhere at once. Talleyrand, the master of intrigue, was plotting in Paris. He opened communications with the Tsar and the Allies. The people of France were exhausted, tired of endless war. Conscription had taken their sons, their brothers, their husbands. The marshals were weary, rich with titles but longing for peace. The Allies marched on Paris and the city surrendered. Marmont, his oldest friend, betrayed him and surrendered his corps. Napoleon was at Fontainebleau, planning a counterattack. He called his marshals to him, eyes burning with resolve. "We march on Paris," he told them. But the room was silent. Ney spoke for them all. "The army will not march. The army will obey its emperor," Napoleon shouted. "The army will obey its generals," Ney replied. It was over. The spell was broken. He sat alone at a small table, the master of nothing. He signed the abdication, renouncing the thrones of France and Italy. That night, he took a vial of poison from his pocket. He had carried it since Russia for this very moment. He drank the opium, seeking the silence of death. But the poison was old and weak. It only made him sick. He vomited violently, cursing that death refused him. He recovered, resigned to his fate. The Allies granted him the island of Elba. It was a mockery, a tiny kingdom for the ruler of Europe. He walked into the courtyard of the chateau to say goodbye. The old guard was assembled, tears running down their scarred faces. He kissed the French flag, pressing it to his heart. He kissed the eagle, the symbol of their glory. "I go, but my heart remains with you," he said. He got into the carriage, driving away into exile. The white flag of the Bourbon rose over Paris. King Louis XVIII returned, fat and gouty. The revolution was rolled back, the clock turned back. But on Elba, the emperor was not sleeping. He paced the cliffs, looking north toward France. He heard the rumors of discontent among the people. The soldiers hid their tricolor cockades inside their shakos. They whispered of the return of the violet in the spring. The cage on Elba could not hold the eagle for long. In February 1815, he slipped past the British guard ships. He sailed with 1,000 men on the brig Inconstant. They landed at Gulf of Juan, stepping onto French soil once more. The news hit Paris like a thunderbolt. The monster has returned. King Louis sent the army to arrest the brigand. Napoleon marched north through the mountains, avoiding the royalist towns. At Laffrey, the 5th Regiment stood blocking his path. Their muskets were leveled, ready to fire on the outlaw. He walked out alone to meet them, wearing his gray coat. He opened his coat, exposing his chest to their guns. "If there is one among you who wants to kill his emperor, here I am." A silence hung in the air, heavy with destiny. Then a cry erupted, "Vive l'Empereur," echoing through the valley. The soldiers dropped their muskets and rushed to embrace him. Marshal Ney promised the king he would bring Napoleon back in an iron cage. But when he saw his old commander, his loyalty crumbled. He drew his sword and joined the march to Paris. The king fled the capital in the middle of the night. Napoleon entered the Tuileries, carried up the stairs by a cheering crowd. He was emperor again, but the world had changed. The Congress of Vienna declared him an outlaw, an enemy of humanity. The armies of Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia mobilized instantly. He knew he had to strike before they could unite. He formed the Army of the North, a weapon of desperate courage. He marched into Belgium, aiming to split the British and Prussians. He defeated the Prussians at Ligny, a brutal and bloody affair. But the victory was incomplete. The Prussians retreated in good order. At Quatre Bras, Marshal Ney fought the British to a standstill. 2 days later, on a muddy field near Waterloo, the armies met. It was Sunday, the 18th of June, 1815. Wellington stood on the ridge of Mont Saint-Jean, waiting. Napoleon waited for the ground to draw in, a fatal delay. The battle began with a diversionary attack on Hougoumont, but the chateau became a magnet, sucking in thousands of French troops. The British guards held the gate, closing it against the storm. Napoleon unleashed his grand battery, 80 guns roaring at once. He sent d'Erlon's corps forward, a massive column of infantry. They marched through the mud, their drums beating the pas de charge. They reached the ridge, breaking through the first British line. But the British heavy cavalry, the Scots Greys, counterattacked. They smashed into the French infantry, sabering the fleeing men. The attack was repulsed, the field covered in dead and dying. Marshal Ney, seeing a weakness, ordered the French cavalry to charge. It was a mistake, unsupported by infantry or artillery. 10,000 horsemen rode up the slope, a sea of steel. The British formed infantry squares bristling with bayonets. The French cavalry flowed around the squares like water around rocks. They charged again and again, horses foaming and dying. But the squares held firm, unbreakable red islands in the smoke. The Prussians began to arrive on the French right flank. Napoleon sent the young guard to hold back the black tide. The farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte finally fell to the French. Wellington's center was wavering, the line was thin. It was the moment of decision, the turning of the tide. Napoleon played his last card, the Imperial Guard. The immortals who had never been defeated marched up the hill. The British guards lay in the tall corn, invisible. "Now, Maitland, now is your time," Wellington shouted. The redcoats rose from the grain and fired a devastating volley. The Imperial Guard recoiled, shaken by the wall of lead. They wavered and then, for the first time, they broke. A cry of horror went through the French army. The Guard retreats. Panic spread like wildfire. The army dissolved into chaos. Wellington waved his hat, signaling the general advance. The Prussians poured in, completing the rout. Napoleon tried to rally his men, forming a square with the Old Guard. But it was useless. The dream was over. He rode away from the field, tears in his eyes. He abdicated a second time, hoping to save his son's throne. But the Allies wanted no more of the Bonaparte dynasty. He fled to Rochefort, hoping to escape to America. But the British blockade was tight. The Bellerophon was waiting. He surrendered to Captain Maitland, throwing himself on the mercy of England. He hoped for a country estate near London, a gentleman's exile. But the British cabinet had a darker plan for the disturber of the world. They sent him to St. Helena, a rock in the South Atlantic. It was a prison without walls, thousands of miles from nowhere. He lived in Longwood House, a damp and windswept villa. Hudson Lowe, the governor, was a petty and suspicious jailer. He denied the emperor his title, calling him General Bonaparte. He censored his mail and restricted his movements on the island. The damp climate gnawed at his health, his strength fading. He fought his last campaign with a pen, dictating his memoirs. He crafted the Napoleonic legend, rewriting history for posterity. I wanted to create a United States of Europe, he claimed. He spoke of liberty and laws, hiding the tyrant behind the statesman. The years dragged on, marked by petty squabbles and boredom. His small court of loyal followers bickered among themselves. He gazed at the ocean, watching the waves beat against the cliffs. The eagle was chained, his wings clipped forever. His health declined rapidly in 1821. Stomach pains racked his body, a slow and agonizing death. He lay on his camp bed, surrounded by the ghosts of the past. The storm raged outside, shaking the wooden house. His last words were whispered in a delirium. France, the army, head of the army, Josephine. He died on the 5th of May as the sun set over the ocean. The British buried him in a nameless grave in the Valley of the Geraniums. They refused to inscribe the name Napoleon on the stone. But his legend could not be buried in a lonely valley. 19 years later, France demanded the return of his ashes. The king sent a ship to bring the emperor home. When they opened the coffin, his body was perfectly preserved. It was as if he were sleeping, untouched by time. He was carried down the Seine in a golden funeral barge. 1 million people lined the streets of Paris in the snow. They cried Vive l'Empereur one last time. He was laid to rest under the golden dome of Les Invalides. He sleeps there still, in red porphyry, surrounded by victories. He was a man of contradictions, a hero and a monster. He built a modern world on a foundation of skulls. He gave us the civil code and the art of total war. He proved that a single will can change the course of history. Destiny is not written in the stars, it is written in blood. The story of Napoleon is the story of human ambition. It is a tragedy of hubris, a testament to genius. The little corporal who became the master of Europe. The exile who conquered death through memory. His shadow still falls across the map of the world.